Hi, welcome back. Last time we talked about the faction struggles that take place within the party during Lenin's final illnesses and after his death in 1924. And I mentioned last time that the faction struggles need to be seen and understood against the backdrop of the new economic policy. That is, they need to be seen in the context of NEP. Because while the faction struggles are in large part about personal enmities and personality conflicts between the various participants, underlying the faction struggles is also an ideological, theoretical, and also a very practical question about NEP itself. How long will NEP last? Recall that NEP had been adopted in 1921 at the 10th Party Congress, pushed through at the insistence of Lenin himself, and intended always as a temporary measure, a tactical retreat, a timely detour on the road to the inevitable construction of socialism. As Lenin himself put it in describing NEP, we'll take 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And through this kind of herky-jerky motion, we will eventually arrive at our destination. Let me show you an image that we've seen before, and I'll come back to these terms here in a moment, but Lenin pointing the way forward into the future. From NEP Russia will emerge socialist Russia. And NEP does allow for an immediate sort of return to economic normalcy in the 1920s. After the chaos of the Civil War, the complete economic collapse associated with that period, the devastating practices of war communism, NEP does allow for some return to a normal economic system, but troubling economic indicators emerge over the course of the decade. During NEP, factory employment remained lower than it had been in 1917. By 1926, nearly a decade after the revolution, the average monthly wage for factory workers was lower in 26 than it had been in 1913. Add to that endemic problems of unemployment. Nearly 1 out of every 6 urban adults was out of work in the 1920s, and all of this in the workers' state. How are we going to build socialism under these conditions? Recall from 2 weeks ago, or a week ago, I should say, all of the social dislocations in especially urban society, problems that the revolution had claimed were byproducts of capitalist inequality, problems that should have been solved by now, problems like poverty, homelessness, alcoholism, drug abuse, suicide, unemployment, prostitution, the dissolution of traditional family units. It's clear as the 1920s wear on that something has to give. The stagnation, the despair, the malaise that many party members especially have come to associate with the new economic policy is beginning to wear thin. And as the mid-late 20s dawn, many rank and file members of the party, men and women, particularly new recruits, particularly those men and women whose experience had been forged in the crucible of the Civil War, as we talked about last time, those who owe their position to the continued patronage of the General Secretary of the party, Comrade Stalin. These party members are eager to abandon this unloved tactical retreat, the new economic policy, and get back in the fast lane of socialist construction. They want to build socialism here in the Russian Soviet Republic. They want to achieve now in their lifetimes the goals of the revolution. And to do so means to bring NEP to an end and to embark on something new, to embark on the full-scale, grandiose program of total industrialization. So what we see by the end of the 1920s is rather ironic. Stalin will implement the very same rapid-fire economic policies that Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev, members of the so-called United Opposition had been advocating in the mid-20s. Stalin had attacked them for wanting to go too fast, for being un-Leninist, for being anti-Leninist in their rejection of NEP. By the mid-1920s, or by the end of the 1920s, Stalin will have ironically come to embrace the economic policies of the United Opposition. And so the end of the 20s witnesses the end of NEP and the introduction of something new. And that's going to be our focus in this lecture. We will see the end of NEP and the introduction of the first 5-year plan. With it, a new direction from above. Party planners will set the course of Soviet Russia in a new direction toward the collectivization of agriculture and the rapid state-sponsored industrialization of the Soviet economy. These transformations that we associate with the so-called 5-year plan, the first 5-year plan from 1928 to 1932, these transformations are so drastic, so far-reaching in scope, that they're often referred to as the second revolution, or the Stalin revolution, after the man who pushes them through. So when I think about the motivations behind the first 5-year plan, unveiled by Stalin at the end of 1928, completed by 1932, I want to think also about the outcomes, and when I think about how we might consider the late 1920s to be a second revolution. What does that mean, a second Russian revolution? That's a term or a phrase that you'll often encounter in the historical literature on the Stalin period. So when I think about what is so revolutionary about this big transformation, we'll focus mostly on collectivization of agriculture. We'll talk a little bit about industrialization, but I do want to focus most of our attention on how the Stalin revolution at the end of the 1920s comes to the Soviet village, and how the Soviet village is transformed as a result of Stalin's 5-year plan. Okay, so these are the terms for today. Let me jump ahead. A photograph we've seen before. Bustling marketplaces, bustling bazaars that had opened up during the years of the new economic policy. You'll recall that the new economic policy had put an end to the grain requisitioning of war communism, with food armies going from village to village, hut to hut, confiscating peasant grain, taking it to the cities. This confiscatory policy, a coercive policy, was replaced, courtesy of the new economic policy, with a graduated tax. Peasant households under NEP could pay their tax in kind, either with grain or produce, or with cash. Surplus grain that the peasants produced could be sold at markets like this one for a profit. And in the early years of NEP, 1922, 23, 24, this worked pretty well. Peasants now had an incentive to produce surplus grain. They can sell surplus grain at a profit. And production levels were up 40%. The idea, as Nikolai Bukharin put it, was that the agricultural sector rebounding, regrowing, would stimulate the industrial sector of the economy, that there was a sort of mutually constitutive, mutually informing, mutually beneficial relationship between these two sectors of the economy. Peasants will sell their surplus grain for cash. They'll use that cash to buy stuff, to buy whatever things are being produced in Soviet factories, which are slowly coming back online. More tax revenue will be generated. More and more factories will be put back in order by state economic planners. And there's more and more production, more and more stuff that peasants can buy with the money they're getting from the surplus grain that they're producing. And Bukharin, who, as I mentioned before, is sort of the preeminent spokesman for NEP, the biggest cheerleader for NEP, says that this is great. We will accumulate, the state will accumulate sufficient capital reserves that we will be able to build socialism through a long NEP. Well, all of this sounded great, and it looked great on paper in the early 1920s, but there's one hitch to it all from the perspective of Bolshevik Party thinkers. For this plan to work, for peasant agriculture to stimulate an industrial recovery, all of this relies on peasants bringing grain to market. And as the 1920s wear on, less and less peasant grain is making its way to market, which means less and less food is coming into the cities, less and less money is available to finance state industrialization. Well, wait a minute. I mean, we see images like this, everything looks fine. Why, over the course of the 20s, are peasants slowing down the surplus grain that they're bringing to market? We have to step back and think about larger economic issues here. They can sell their grain now and other produce for profit, for cash, but cash is only worth something if there's something to spend it on. And the industrial recovery under NEP is so slow and so uneven that peasants don't have anything attractive to spend their cash on. So peasants begin to make a calculation by the mid-1920s. Rather than break our backs producing extra grain, which we're selling in the marketplace for cash, using that cash to earn enough money to buy a radio made in a crappy Soviet factory, a radio that may explode when you turn it on or catch fire. Instead, peasants are making a different calculation. Screw it, they say. Let's hoard our surplus grain and use it to distill home-brewed alcohol, which can be sold on the black market for enormous profit. So the best evidence of this is 1927. The harvest of 1927 is a terrific harvest, but peasants are not bringing the anticipated amount of grain to market. The state's actual grain collection in 1927 falls 2 million tons short of the minimum expectation. So the state is faced with a grain crisis. This is the so-called procurement crisis of 1927-28. And for Stalin, it's the last straw for NEP. Stalin says this is unacceptable. We cannot be faced with a grain crisis. If we're faced with a grain crisis, we'll be in the same mess we were in back in 1920, 1921. In a speech before the Central Committee of the Communist Party, Stalin says, to achieve the final victory of socialism in our country, we need to catch up with and overtake the West in both the technical and economic sense. Either we do it or we shall be crushed. When we talked about the Civil War and the legacy of the Civil War, I mentioned that there's this enduring fear of capitalist encirclement. The enemy is on our very borders. The enemy seeks to crush the socialist experiment. As the Civil War receded into the past, fear of capitalist encirclement, far from diminishing, grew ever sharper. Think about what's taking place across Europe in the mid-late 1920s. Fascism is on the rise. Mussolini has taken power in Italy. Hitler and the Nazis are on the rise in Germany. There are deteriorating relations between the Soviet Union and Great Britain, and the political climate across the continent is shifting decidedly toward the right of the political spectrum. So capitalism, imperialism, and newly emerging fascism all appear from the perspective of the Soviet leadership as looming threats. World revolution, on which we had staked our bottom dollar, seems to be indefinitely postponed. And so Stalin decides that now, at the end of the 1920s, the Soviet Union needs to industrialize and rearm as quickly as possible. Stalin says, we must industrialize the economy. We must collectivize agriculture. We'll turn to that in a moment. And we must do this as quickly as possible, or else the capitalist West will destroy us. And Stalin repeats this mantra in speech after speech throughout 1927, 1928. NEP is no longer working. This current system of relying on the peasants to bring grain to market on their own, relying on the goodwill of the peasants, this is no longer working. We cannot take the project of building socialism and allow it to be held hostage by politically backwards peasants who aren't so keen on Bolshevism in the first place. So by the end of the 1920s, Stalin has decided that NEP must come to an end. He's also decided that this is what Lenin would have wanted. And so we must now set a new course in order to construct the socialist system. Before Stalin can do that, he has to eliminate or push out of the way any party rivals who might oppose him. And so in November of 1929, the so-called right opposition is expelled from the Politburo. Nikolai Bukharin, the champion of a long NEP, is kicked out of the Politburo along with his most prominent political allies, Alexei Rykov and Mikhail Tomsky, all three men shown here. Stalin attacks the three as right-wing deviationists who are trying to destroy the party from within, who are trying to subvert the mission of the party. They're trying to prolong NEP unnaturally. They're trying to reintroduce capitalism. This phrase, deviationism, is a very interesting one. And I want to go back to this image that I showed you last time. Stalin, and here you see a political cartoon from 1928-29 showing Stalin standing firmly on the path of Lenin, while the right opposition, Bukharin and Rykov, move across the much shakier, opportunistic path. Stalin is always able to portray himself as the true disciple of Lenin, the bearer of Lenin's flame, the savior of the party. So Stalin is able to use against the right opposition the same sort of rhetorical gymnastics that he had used to eliminate Trotsky, Zinoviev, and Kamenev, the so-called united opposition or left opposition, just a few years before, in the mid-20s. This idea of deviationism that I just mentioned before, this is the phrase that Stalin and Stalin's men use when they attack their political opponents. The idea is that there is one proper path, the path of Lenin, the path down which Stalin is presently leading the party. And the enemies of the party would deviate from that path, right? They would steer us off course. So the right opposition is kicked out. The left opposition, as we've seen, has already been removed. Here you see a Stalinist political cartoon mocking the leaders of the left or united opposition, Kamenev, Zinoviev, and Trotsky. The little signs over their hospital beds describes them as suffering from opposition fever. And the caption at the bottom describes them as the chronically ill. So the left opposition is gone. The right opposition is pushed out now in 1928-29. As with Zinoviev and Kamenev, so too Rykov, Bukharin, and Tomsky recant the errors of their ways. They are forced or obliged, compelled, if you will, to appear at a meeting of the Central Committee and publicly confess that they were wrong and Stalin was right. Our views, Bukharin says, have proved erroneous. All three men are permitted to stay in the party, but they are reduced to very minor functionary roles. And in fact, all three men will die at the height of the Stalinist purges in the late 1930s. So the left opposition is gone, the right opposition is gone, and now the faction struggles are over. The Soviet state and the Communist Party are both completely in Stalin's hands by the end of the 1920s, and they will remain so for the next 2.5 decades until Stalin's death in 1953. And here you see a photo from 1929-1930 showing Stalin in the center and his inner circle of trusted advisors and political allies standing around him. Ordzhonikidze, Voroshilov, Kuibyshev, Stalin, Kalinin, Kaganovich, and Kirov. And standing above them, of course, a bust, a statue of Lenin, always associating his own political authority with the authority inherent in the person and legacy of Lenin. So Stalin controls the party. Stalin controls the state. And now, at the end of the 1920s, Stalin takes it upon himself to solve the economic problem, to solve the grain crisis. Who is to blame? Stalin asks. Who is to blame for the grain crisis? Why are peasants not taking grain to market? Well, it can't be the fault of the party's policies. Stalin reasons the party is always right. Taking a page from the book of Lenin, Stalin sets his sights on blaming the kulaks. Clearly, it is the kulaks, the rich peasants, who are to blame for the grain crisis. The kulaks, the rich peasants, are hoarding grain. The kulaks are well known as the enemies of socialism, the enemies of the revolution. Comrade Lenin taught us as much. So the kulaks must be squeezed, Stalin says. Pressure must be brought to bear on them. We cannot let the kulaks, class enemies, enemies of the revolution, determine our economic policy. If we do, we are lost. Grain surpluses will decrease, the cities will starve, industrial production will suffer, and the capitalist fascist West will swallow up Soviet Russia. So in the spring of 1928, Stalin and the members of the Politburo, who are firmly on Stalin's side, vote to implement what Stalin calls extraordinary measures to solve the grain crisis. The Politburo, at Stalin's urging, votes to carry out brutal mass reprisals against the so-called kulak hoarders. What does that mean? That means that all available food surplus will be confiscated from the kulaks. It will be taken by force. Any kulaks who resist, saboteurs, wreckers, as they are so called, will be arrested. So what we see by 1928 is that that brief breathing space of NEP is over, and the machinery of state repression rolls into motion once more. Stalin is following policies taken straight out of the Civil War era. In July of 1928, Stalin tells the Central Committee of the Communist Party, we will press down upon and gradually squeeze the capitalist elements in the countryside, by which he means the kulaks. We will squeeze the kulaks, even if in some cases it brings them to ruin. At Stalin's instructions, village assemblies meet all across Soviet Russia to label and classify every peasant household in the village by economic status. The village assemblies meet and they vote to label themselves and their neighbors as one of three official legal categories: poor peasants, middle peasants, or kulaks. And as we talked about a couple of weeks ago, being a kulak was completely in the eye of the beholder. In poorer parts of rural Russia, a kulak might be someone who happened to own his own horse or own his own cow. But now, what Stalin is accomplishing by having the village assemblies label each household as poor, middle, or kulak, he's creating a database. He's creating a paper trail in order to identify the kulak enemy. Those households labeled by their neighbors as kulaks are now ordered by law to deliver grain shipments directly to the state, and those who fail to meet the quotas put upon them are prosecuted under Article 107 of the Soviet Criminal Code. That is to say, they're prosecuted on charges of economic speculation, which is a fancy way of saying black marketeering, profiteering, economic crime, in essence. This is a poster from 1929, quoting Stalin. The caption reads, "We will intensify the socialist offensive in the city and in the village." And again, note this very militaristic language, which is again a return to the spirit of the Civil War. What's going on in the countryside, as this poster reminds us, is an offensive. It is a military-style campaign. And we see tractors here rolling off the factory line and heading off to the village to do battle on the front lines of the grain war. So by declaring NEP to be over in 1928, with his so-called extraordinary measures, Stalin is reintroducing violent, coercive measures against the peasantry by agents of state power. And I think this poster is a classic image of that. We will intensify the socialist offensive in the city and in the countryside. So the breathing space of NEP is over. The Soviet Union is at war once again, at war against its own citizens, the kulaks. Well, you can take as much grain as you want from the kulaks, but that's not going to fundamentally alter modes of production, modes of agricultural production in the countryside. It's not going to fundamentally alter how grain is getting from the village to the city. So Stalin says we need, as he puts it, a way out of the grain crisis, right? We need a solution to this problem. Stalin gives a speech, a graduation speech, in May of 1928 to the students who have completed their studies at Sverdlov University in Moscow. And Stalin, in this speech, says that the way out of the grain crisis lies in a new model of agricultural production, a collectivist model, a socialist model. He says the way out of the grain crisis lies, firstly, in the transition from small, backward, scattered peasant farms to large-scale, amalgamated, socialized farms, farms equipped with machinery, farms armed with scientific knowledge, farms capable of producing a maximum level of grain for the market. The solution to the grain crisis lies in transitioning from individual peasant farming to collective socialized farming. So here, for the first time, at the end of the 1920s, May 1928, Stalin reveals his plan for Soviet agriculture, the collectivization of agriculture. What does that mean? Bolshevik economic thinking, as we've seen, leaned toward the centralized, the planned, right? Don't leave things up to the market. The best economic outcomes could be achieved through expert planning, through expert organization, through centralization. So the idea was that 24 million individual peasant households operating on their own, growing whatever they felt like, whenever they felt like, harvesting whenever they felt like, taking their crops to market whenever they felt like. This is inefficient. In fact, it's impossible to supervise. So we need to collectivize agriculture. We need to take these individual peasant family farms and merge them into larger collectivized production units, collective farms. In Russian, a kolkhoz. The plural is kolkhozy. A collective farmer, if he's male, is a kolkhoznik. A female collective farm worker is a kolkhoznitsa. These new collective farms, so the thinking went, would produce food much more efficiently and in much larger quantities than individual peasant family farms, homesteads, etc. In part because the new kolkhozy, the new collective farms, would be equipped with state-of-the-art machinery and technology from Moscow and the other industrial centers, right? So we can make production as mechanized, as modernized as possible, right? Tractors will replace wooden plows, right? New machinery will replace centuries-old backwards technology. And just as there were production norms in other branches of industry, in mining, in steel production, in heavy industry, so too, under collectivization, there would be production quotas set for agriculture. State and party planners would determine how much grain the collective farms would grow, how many metric tons of potatoes would be produced, how many metric tons of carrots and turnips, and so forth and so on. So the idea here, again, is that the collective farms would produce not according to the whims of the market, but rather collective farms would produce in accordance with directives and goals established by economic planners working in government bureaucratic offices in the capital, right? Central planning is rational. Central planning makes sense. Central planning avoids the ups and downs, the fluctuations of the market. So the same kind of thinking that we saw with Vesa and the move toward economic planning at the beginning of war communism is now reintroduced by Stalin at the end of the 1920s, and it's informing the decision to move toward the collectivization of agriculture. The final piece of the puzzle here is that whatever profits the state derives from the collective farms will not be wasted on radios and booze, but rather the state will use the proceeds, the state will use the profits of agriculture to finance the development of heavy industry. So both sides of the economic coin, the agricultural and the industrial, will help fuel the other. As agriculture becomes more efficient and more productive, there will be an accompanying boom in industrial production. We'll build more and more tractors, more and more lines of rail will be laid connecting the far-flung regions of the Soviet Union. More and more military hardware will be built up as well. And this is a very important part of the puzzle because, again, Stalin is terrified, is probably too mild a word to describe the fear that Stalin and the party leadership at the end of the 1920s feel toward the rise of fascism across Europe. Within the party, there is great enthusiasm for Stalin's new direction in economic policy. Right? NEP had long outstayed its welcome. Most party members thought, time to move on, time to get back onto the fast track, into the fast lane of socialist construction, to get back to that enthusiastic, voluntaristic, romantic, heroic spirit that had characterized the years of civil war. Plus, if you think about it, and this is cruel to say, but by the end of the 1920s, anyone who would have opposed Stalin, that is to say, members of the so-called right opposition, have been silenced. So naturally, there is enthusiasm within the party for Stalin's new direction in economic policy. But that enthusiasm is confined mostly to the cities and urban centers. Stalin's new agricultural policies are not at all popular in the village, in the countryside. What we see over the course of 1928-29, as Stalin embarks on this new direction, is that peasant marketplaces that had flourished under NEP are closed down. The private trade in grain, the private trade in other foodstuffs is shut down as well. And you see this remarkable shrinkage taking place in the private activity of the Soviet economy. What this chart shows you is legal private economic activity as a percentage of the overall Soviet economy. So bear with me as I explain this. 1924-25, 1925-26, private economic activity, that is to say, peasants selling grain for profit in the marketplace, had accounted for almost 45% of all economic activity in the country. By the time we get to 1930, thanks to Stalin's sharp curtailment of these policies, it's shrunk to a mere shadow of where it had been just 5 or 6 years before. So coercion is a big part of this story. The markets are shut down. The kulaks who had been bringing grain to market are now burdened with such heavy quotas on grain delivery from the state that they cannot sell surplus grain at market. There is no surplus grain to sell. We'll come back to this chart in a moment. In November of 1928, Stalin unveils the first 5-year plan. And this is a massive, overarching program that details how the Soviet economy will be overhauled, restructured, and modernized. The plan is unveiled at the end of 1928, and it is adopted overwhelmingly with great enthusiasm and stormy applause by the 16th Party Congress in April of 1929. The effect of the 5-year plan is that it destroys NEP, right? The NEP economy, which had been a mixed economy, combining socialist elements with private elements, is no more. By 1932, as you can see from this last pairing on the bar graph, 95% of the Soviet economy is socialized. So that weird hybrid economy of the 1920s, the mixture of socialist and petty capitalist, has ceased to exist by the end of the 5-year plan. And the balance has shifted overwhelmingly, decisively toward a socialist economy. And it will remain so in Soviet Russia until the late 1980s. The 5-year plan is both a policy and a document, or I should say, perhaps more accurately, a set of documents outlining in great detail every aspect of economic production that will take place in Soviet Russia over the next 5 years, hence 5-year plan. And plan, because as we've seen, the preference decidedly was for economic centralization, planning down to the smallest detail every aspect of production and consumption. The two key aspects of Stalin's 5-year plan are the collectivization of agriculture and the rapid industrialization of the industrial sphere. We need to get industry back where it belongs. The 5-year plan sets quotas for agriculture and industry. The first 5-year plan says that 20% of peasant households need to be collectivized within the next 5 years. 20%. Other than set that figure, central economic planners did very little in the way of providing clear or precise guidelines for how that would take place. It simply says 20% of peasant households need to be collectivized within the next 5 years. They need to be put onto collective farms. What does that look like? How will that take place? At what tempo should that take place? What legal procedures need to be followed? The 5-year plan is very vague on this point. And the idea is that local party officials, local government officials can figure this out themselves. Well, if you're a local party leader out in the provinces, if you're a local state official in a rural district, you know that collectivization is coming. You know that you have to collectivize a certain number of peasant households, 20% over the next 5 years. But how you're going to do that is an open question. There's no guidance from the center, from Moscow. There's just the order, the injunction to go and do thus and such. So rural party leaders, local officials out in the provinces are trying to figure this out on their own. There's an improvisational feel to collectivization in the first months of the collectivization drive. And in those first months, collectivization takes place at a very, very fast, very, very rapid tempo. What would happen is that village assemblies would meet, all the households, representatives from every household in the village would come to meet, poor peasants, middle peasants, and kulaks, and they would take a vote. Are we going to pool our land, pool our seed reserves, pool our livestock, and form a collective farm? Yay or nay? There'd be discussion, there'd be debate, there'd be some drunken fisticuffs thrown, no doubt, and then at the end, there'd be a vote. Now, this is a photograph, probably staged, of a village assembly having weighed the evidence before them, voting overwhelmingly to join the kolkhoz, to set up a collective farm. There's always a carrot or stick to Stalinist policies, as we'll see over the next week. And the carrot here is that by joining the collective farm, there are some material advantages that may await you. A new way of buit, a new way of life for the collective farmer, a new modern, electrified, technologically progressive, forward-thinking, cultured way of life awaits the kolkhoznik and the kolkhoznitsa, the collective farmers, when they join the collective farm movement. That's the carrot. The stick, as one Soviet official put it at the time, all who do not join the kolkhoz are enemies of Soviet power. Well, when you put it that way, how can you not help but vote da, or yes, in favor of joining the collective farms? Here, another photograph of the same sort of scenario. Peasant householders on either side of the table, a young urban party member, perhaps a student at one of the agricultural institutes in Moscow, coming out to the village to make a hard sell to the peasants, explaining to them the material and political advantages of joining the collective farm movement. As I said, this goes really, really quickly. Collectivization proceeds at a very rapid tempo. In June of 1929, 3.9% of all peasant households in the Russian Republic of the Soviet Union are collectivized. 3.9% of all peasant households in the Russian Republic of the Soviet Union have been collectivized. That's just weeks after the 16th Party Congress has approved the 5-year plan. By September of 1929, that figure has doubled. 7.4% of peasant households have collectivized. By December, 15%. And by March of 1930, there are 14 million peasant families in collective farms across the Soviet Union. That's 59% of all peasant households. Now, stop and think for a minute. The 5-year plan had called for 20% of peasant households to be collectivized over the course of 5 years. But local officials pushing hard have collectivized nearly 3 times as many in just over a year. Why are they pushing so hard? Why are local officials making such a hard sell, as you can see in this photograph? Well, local officials are pushing collectivization because they're afraid that if they don't, they'll be demoted, or worse, on charges of deviationism, right? The last thing that a local party boss or a district party official wants to have hanging over his head is the label of being a right oppositionist or a right deviationist, right? Don't be like Bukharin, Tomsky, Rykov, those who had argued for a long nep. If you want to avoid those hints and allegations from settling on your person and ruining your political career, and with it your life, then you had better push for collectivization as speedily as possible. And that's exactly what's happening. So fast was the drive for collectivization, in fact, that in the so-called Black Earth region of Russia, the richest agricultural territories of the Soviet Union, long known, going back centuries, as the Black Earth region because the soil was so fertile and so rich. 85% of peasant households in the so-called Black Earth region are collectivized by spring 1930. This is crazy. It's also a bit of a problem because many peasants don't want to go into the collective farms. In fact, we might say most peasants don't want to go into the collective farms. They don't want to pool their land. Remember, the motivating factor behind peasant political activity since 1917, arguably since 1905, was land hunger. We need land, we need land, we need land, right? That's what drove the peasants into the arms of the SRs in 1917. We want land. Now, the peasants are told they're going to have to pool their land and their livestock. And so many peasants are resisting this push toward collectivization. And peasants are beginning to grumble. Peasants are beginning to describe collectivization as a second serfdom. In the winter of 1929 and the first months of 1930, you have mass armed uprisings taking place all across the Soviet countryside. And these mass armed uprisings are political, economic protests, demonstrations against collectivization. In 1930 alone, more than 13,000 uprisings and rebellions take place across rural Russia. More than 13,000. Some of these are quite small, easily suppressed by a local detachment of Red Army soldiers. Others are far more serious. Many Orthodox Christian peasants and Protestants in the villages as well are spreading rumors. If you're a peasant in 1929, 1930, chances are what you know about the world around you comes to you from stories that you've heard, rumors that you've helped to spread, and the religious beliefs to which you subscribe. So the vast majority of peasants are Orthodox Christians, but across Russia and Ukraine, you have a lot of Protestant sectarians as well. The word sectarian is a rather disparaging one that the Orthodox Church had used in the 19th century to describe Baptists, Jehovah's Witnesses, and other kind of Protestant offshoots that had come into Russia and won converts among some of the rural audiences. They are a minority as far as believers go. These Protestant sectarians are a minority of the rural population, but Protestants, much more so than Orthodox Christians, know their Bibles very well. And Protestant sectarians flipping through the Old and New Testaments to try and make sense of the enormous political and social change that's coming with collectivization, interpret collectivization as the end of the world. This is the apocalypse. This is what was foretold in the book of Revelations. And so rumors are spreading across the Soviet countryside that the collective farm marks the debut of Antichrist. Those who sign up to join the collective farms will be branded with the mark of Antichrist. They will be cast into hell on the day of judgment. Not only will their cattle and livestock become common property to be used by all, but so too will their women, their wives and daughters, and all sorts of powerful rumors spread across the countryside. And this helps to fuel popular resistance to the collectivization drive. It's not just holding on to your land. It's not just holding on to your favorite sheep. It's about holding on to the very order of things. It's about holding on to the divinely ordained, God-given way things ought to be versus giving in to this new demonic system that comes from Antichrist, i.e. the Bolsheviks. And there's really fascinating work that's been done on this topic. If you're interested in reading more about it, Lynn Viola at the University of Toronto has written a lot about these kind of apocalyptic visions of the end days that sweep across the Soviet countryside. So really fascinating stuff. Peasants motivated to resist now are burning down the granaries of collective farms. They're poisoning wells on collective farms. They're murdering Soviet officials. Many even set fire to their own homes, to their own possessions, rather than surrender them to the collective farms. Peasants, in many cases, choose to slaughter their own animals rather than give them over to the new collective farm administration. Reliable indicators suggest that 1/4 of all livestock in the Soviet Union were slaughtered in this manner. 1/4. By February and March of 1930, 14 million head of cattle were slaughtered by peasants resisting collectivization. 40 million horses. This is 4 million horses, excuse me. These statistics here show you the livestock losses over the course of the first 5-year plan. Huge losses in sheep and goats, big losses in hogs, horses, and cattle as well. So by the spring of 1930, you have, for the first time in 10 years, a countryside that is once again in flames. Remember, the Bolsheviks had pushed too hard in 1920 with their grain requisitioning campaigns. The food armies had pushed too hard, too fast. The result was essentially a new civil war brewing in the countryside. Now, 10 years later, pushing too hard, too fast with collectivization, many Bolshevik party leaders fear we have another potential for civil war on our hands once more. Stalin recognizes that the situation is getting out of hand. You wouldn't know it from this photograph, Stalin relaxing at his dacha, but Stalin realizes the situation is getting out of hand. And so on March 2nd, 1930, Stalin publishes an article, an op-ed piece, in the official newspaper of the Soviet Union, Pravda. And Stalin's article is entitled "Dizzy with Success." And this is an old Russian phrase, basically meaning that you've gotten a bit ahead of yourself, right? You've gone too far too fast. In this piece, "Dizzy with Success," Stalin states, for the record, that 60% of peasant farms in the Soviet Union have been collectivized. 60%. We have exceeded by 100% the goals laid out in the 5-year plan. We've doubled in just 1 year the plan set for us over 5 years by party economic planners. Stalin goes on to say, people are often intoxicated by such success. They become dizzy with success. They lose all sense of proportion. They lose the faculty of understanding reality as it is. And people who become dizzy with success, Stalin says, are dangerous and harmful to our cause. Stalin, as I mentioned, had trained for the priesthood in a rather half-hearted, half-assed fashion. One effect of his seminary training was that in his writing, Stalin, and in his speeches too, Stalin retained the kind of repetitious call and response style of the Orthodox Christian liturgy. And you see that in "Dizzy with Success." He says, the art of leadership is a serious matter. One must not lag behind the movement, because to do so means you lose contact with the masses. But neither must one run too far ahead of the movement, because to run too far ahead means to lose the masses and to isolate oneself. So Stalin is taking this kind of Goldilocks approach here. A true party leader, right, must intuitively sense where he stands in relation to the workers and peasants. You can't run too far ahead of them or you'll leave them in the dust. And you can't fall too far behind or they're leading you. So Stalin says that, unfortunately, rural party officials, district officials, they've screwed up. It's their fault, right? They're dizzy with success. And Stalin, in the article, says that things have gone a little fast, a little faster than we'd have liked. So this article, "Dizzy with Success," March 2nd, 1930, is an attempt by Stalin to shift the blame for the ruthlessness of the collectivization campaign onto the shoulders of supposedly overzealous officials who went too far too fast. Never mind the fact that these overzealous officials were simply following directives coming from Stalin himself. So it's a monumental piece of political insincerity. In the wake of its publication, more than 4,300 local, state, and party officials are arrested on charges of left deviationism. That is to say, of pushing collectivization too fast, too far. 1,000 of them are shot, which reminds us that political mistakes under Stalinism bear consequences of an extreme nature. 22,000 more local officials are fired from their jobs, demoted, or sent off to Siberia. So I mentioned the piece, "Dizzy with Success," and I mentioned the kind of aftershocks of the piece because it's a typical Stalinist tactic that we'll see again and again, deflecting blame onto others. And this sort of feint, this kind of maneuver, allows Stalin to salvage his own name and salvage his own prestige by smearing honest, loyal party workers beneath him. Well, if collectivization has gone too far, if people are killing their horses, burning their grain, somebody's to blame. It's not Stalin. It must be the local officials. It's their fault that collectivization has taken place so fast and amidst such violence. At the same time, it's to Stalin's credit that the operation has been as successful to date as it is. So it's a great example of Stalin scapegoating others for his own political failings, right? We'll see this again and again, particularly with the purges. For about a year after Dizzy with Success, there's a brief lull in the tempo of collectivization, but it picks up again. And by 1933, 2/3 of peasant households have been collectivized, not just in the Russian Republic of the Soviet Union, but in Ukraine, in the Caucasus, and in Soviet Central Asia as well. Collectivization was particularly disruptive in Central Asia because in Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, many of the traditional nomadic tribes are forcibly settled into collective farms and forced to take up agriculture, to abandon their nomadic pastoral grazing of sheep and other livestock and take up sedentary year-round agricultural work. By 1940, 97% of peasant households across the USSR, across the Soviet Union, have been collectivized. 97%. And so Stalin's goal, the party's goal of sploshная коллективизация, full-scale, total collectivization, has been achieved. 97% of peasant households collectivized by 1940. Stalin hasn't lost a minute's worth of sleep. Collectivization brings the spirit of class warfare, which had long been a hallmark of Bolshevik political rhetoric. It brings class warfare to the countryside. In February of 1930, by which time collectivization is already underway, the Central Committee of the Communist Party issues a decree ruling that the collective farms will be composed exclusively of poor and middle peasants. There is no room, as this 1930 poster says, there is no room in our collective farm for priests and kulaks. So, by law, the kulak is now excluded from joining the collective farm. Here, another poster illustrating that same sort of sentiment. You see a young, healthy collective farmer in red wearing a Lenin cap, and he says, no, we will throw the kulaks out of the kolkhoz. And you see this angry, snarling kulak on the far left here of the image, his nose bulbous from drinking. The idea, of course, that these enemies of October, enemies of the revolution, enemies of socialism, cannot be permitted into the collective farm. We must throw them out because by their very presence, they will contaminate and destroy the collective farm from within. This idea of contamination, the enemy, the class enemy, as a contagious presence that can do real harm to the body politic. We saw this in the Civil War. That strain of propaganda resurfaces again during the collectivization drive. So not only is there no place for kulaks and priests in the collective farm, and you see this woman saying no to the little vermin of kulaks and priests at the bottom, but we will throw out the kulaks, right? Just as we would throw out cockroaches and rats. Another image from 1930, down with the kulaks. And there's a quote from Lenin at the top that basically says, the kulaks are the most beast-like, the coarsest, the most savage exploiters. And it goes on and on and on about how horrible the kulaks are. And the image here, of course, is a kind of pun, a visual pun on the verbal pun that lies at the heart of the word kulak itself. Kulak, again, means fist. It refers to the greedy, grasping, avaricious nature of the kulak. But here you see the strong, muscled fist of the working class punching the kulak in the back, kicking him out of the collective farm. And you see in the background something that we'll come back to momentarily, but the contour, the shape of village life has changed with collectivization. The church is no longer a church. Presumably it's a government meeting place or a workers' club or a silo for the housing of grain. The church now bears a red flag. And in place of old wooden scratch plows, new state-of-the-art technology, the tractor. Well, if you're going to throw the kulaks out of the kolkhoz, out of the collective farm, if you're going to cast them out, if you're going to say there is no room for them on the collective farm, then from there, it's just a brief logical jump that not only must they be kept out of the kolkhoz, but in fact, the kulaks must be eliminated. They must be liquidated. Stalin announces in December of 1929 that we must eliminate the kulaks as a class. The kulaks, he says, are the sworn enemies of the collective farm movement. In November of 1930, in the pages of Pravda, the Soviet novelist Maxim Gorky writes, "We are entitled to consider ourselves to be in a state of war. The logical consequence of this is that if the enemy does not surrender, he is to be exterminated." Collectivization is a war, the party says. And in 1929, 1930, Stalin, in speech after speech, talks about the grain front. We are fighting on the grain front. Just as in the years of civil war, we fought on a military front against our enemies in the field, just as throughout the 1920s and into the 30s, we will fight on the cultural front to build a new buit, to build a new way of life. Now we are fighting on the agricultural front, on the grain front. And the enemy opposing us on the other side of the front line is, of course, the kulak. And this language of elimination, this language of liquidation, again, takes us back to the spirit of Red Terror that we saw in 1918 that persisted throughout the Civil War years, and the idea of liquidation, elimination, invests the kulak with a less than human nature, right? The elimination, the liquidation, as if it were a surgical procedure, right? This is very chilling political language, and it's deployed deliberately against the Kulak enemy. That slogan is not simply an idle, empty phrase. Here you see collective farmers marching beneath a banner that echoes Stalin's pledge: we will liquidate the Kulak as a class. We will strike a blow, this poster says, against the Kulak. And the Kulak, again, reflecting that kind of militaristic imagery, the Kulak is surrounded now by, on all sides, he's outgunned, he's outmaneuvered by these tractors representing Soviet modernity. And the Kulak himself is this kind of wall-eyed, monstrous figure, clutching his rifle, a cross around his neck, about to be plowed under by the forces of Soviet modernity. So we will strike a blow against the Kulak. Kulaks, again, disbarred from joining the collective farms, kulaks find themselves now as pariahs, outcasts in their own villages, where they and their families had lived for generations. Kulaks are now outsiders, right? The men and women, the families who had been the most prosperous, perhaps the most respected, the most kind of socially desirable matches for peasant matrimonial politics. Now all of a sudden, the kulak in this topsy-turvy world has been turned into a former person. Kulaks find themselves now divided into three legal categories. Category 1 kulaks, who were the richest and therefore the most politically suspect, are ordered to be sent off from their home villages to forced labor settlements in Central Asia, the Arctic North, and the remote stretches of eastern Siberia. And here you see grain being confiscated from a kulak farm. The kulaks themselves, category 1 kulaks, are about to be deported by order of the Soviet government, deported from their home village, their hometown, and sent off to the wilds of Central Asia or Siberia. Altogether, 5 million peasant men, women, and children were deported from their homes as part of this de-kulakization project, which again sounds like a medical procedure, a surgical procedure. We will extract the kulak from the socioeconomic setting of the Soviet village. We will pull him out so that the organism itself may be saved. 5 million peasant men, women, and children were dekulakized, deported to Siberia. Those who survived the transport, those who survived being stuffed into cattle cars like animals, died of starvation and exposure in the harsh subarctic environments where they were dropped off. For those who remained on the collective farms, the poor and middle peasants, hunger was a major problem. Everyone knew that the collective farms were hungry places. Not a word of this was ever mentioned in the official Soviet press. Boris Pasternak, one of the most famous Soviet, or I should say Russian poets of the 1910s, 1920s, later became a novelist. most famous for Dr. Zhivago, which we'll talk about when we get to the 1960s. Pasternak was part of an organized tour of Soviet writers taken to the collective farms. I muddled up that sentence. What I should say is that Pasternak and other Soviet writers were led by tour guides from the Ministry of Agriculture and the Ministry of Education. They were taken on a guided tour of the collective farms so they could see for themselves how the Soviet peasant was building the future of tomorrow, today. Pasternak writes in his memoirs what he saw in the countryside in the early 1930s. He says, back then, in the early 30s, it was fashionable among writers to visit the collective farms in order to gather material about the new way of life being constructed in the villages. I wanted to be like everyone else, and so I too set out on such a trip with the intention of writing a book about collectivization. But there are no words to express what I saw. There was such inhuman, unimaginable misery, such frightful poverty, that it began to take on an almost abstract quality, as if it were beyond what the conscious mind could absorb. I fell ill, Pasternak writes, and I could write nothing for an entire year. The shock of actually seeing the poverty, the misery, the indigence on display in the collective farms so shook Pasternak to his core that he fell ill and could write nothing for a year. What went wrong? The collective farms had to produce so much grain to satisfy the central economic planners in Moscow that the peasants themselves were left with practically nothing to feed their families. And the result was artificial famine. As I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, all famine is the result of human policy. Famine is the result of human choices. Crops may fail, rivers may flood, droughts may occur, disease may strike the wheat in the field, but famine is the consequence of human choices made by political actors. We now know, thanks to declassified archival documents across the former Soviet Union, just how bad things were in 1931 and 1932 across the rural stretches of the Soviet Union. Let me give you an example of this. A letter, 1932, a letter written by a fellow named Gusyov. He's a collective farmer. He's writing to party leaders in Moscow, talking about how bad things are in the northern Caucasus, his home region where he lives, where his family lives. Why does he write to Moscow? Why does he write to Comrade Stalin? This is part of an old tradition of peasants petitioning the Tsar. If only the little father Tsar knew how badly his loving subjects are suffering, he would make everything right. And the archives are crammed full of letters, painstakingly carved out grammatical mistakes, spelling mistakes, peasants writing to Stalin. Dear Comrade Stalin, if you only knew how we suffer, you would make things all right. Fix things for us, help us, save us. So this certain Gusyov writes to the members of the Politburo, he writes to Comrade Stalin, and he says, we on the collective farm are left naked, barefoot, with half a pound of barley bread per day. We eat our cabbage without butter. It is terrible to see a big, strong man cry, but he cries because they tricked him with the kolkhoz, because now he's left without a farm, without bread, without clothes, and without freedom. And there's an appeal again to that revolutionary value of freedom. The revolution has brought us freedom. The kolkhoz has instituted a second serfdom. It has bound the peasant, so the peasants argue, has bound the peasant to the land as tightly and as unflinchingly as ever the institution of serfdom did bind the peasant to their noble owner's land back in the 19th century. This is just one letter from one village in one district in the Northern Caucasus. Conditions were bad across the Soviet Union. The Volga region, in Kazakhstan, in Central Asia, in the Black Earth region, but the situation was worst of all in Soviet Ukraine. In 1932, Stalin personally picked up his pen and raised the grain quotas in Soviet Ukraine by 44%. He took a number that was already ridiculously high and made it now astronomically high. Raising the grain quotas for collective farms in Soviet Ukraine by 44% meant that there wouldn't be enough grain for the peasants to feed themselves. There wouldn't be enough grain left over to store seed grain for next spring and summer. So the decree that Stalin signed, raising the grain quotas by 44%, condemned millions of peasants to death by starvation. Because Soviet law said that no collective farm grain could be distributed to the collective farmers until the state's quota is first met. There's no way that quota could ever have been met. Therefore, there's no way that even a stalk of grain could be released to collective farmers in Soviet Ukraine. It condemned millions of men, women, and children to death. In 1932-33, party officials, agents of the Cheka, Red Army soldiers, policemen go village to village, house to house, door to door across the Ukrainian agricultural heartlands, searching for hidden sacks of grain. There must be grain. The kulaks are hiding grain. Every stalk of grain, even seed grain, was taken by the requisitioners. So you have a scene straight out of 1920 of food armies once more going house to house, taking grain. Mass starvation ensues across Soviet Ukraine. Again, a famine created by human policy. We know from horrific reports that men, women, and children were reduced to eating dogs and cats, bark from trees, even human flesh. More than 2,500 people were prosecuted on charges of cannibalism in Ukraine during the early 1930s. A law issued in August of 1932 declared that any man, woman, or child caught taking even a handful of grain from a collective farm silo would be shot. Shot. Unless there were mitigating circumstances. If so, the sentence would be reduced to 10 years imprisonment. The peasants have nowhere to go. They are prevented by law from leaving their home village. Stalin has introduced a new system of internal passports. You cannot leave the collective farm unless your obligations to the farm have been met, and unless the farm has met its quota. The farms cannot meet their quotas. No one can leave the collective farms. 3.5 million Ukrainian men, women, and children died during the famine of 1932-33. Those estimates are on the low side. You'll see figures, statistics going upwards of 10 million. Many Ukrainians today, referring to the so-called Holodomor, the death by hunger, will refer to it as a genocide. Again, it is a forced hunger. It is an artificial famine that is induced by these impossibly high grain quotas ordered by Stalin, with the partial goal of stamping out Ukrainian separatism, Ukrainian nationalism, by literally starving Ukrainians. And you see some images from the famine. A man and his emaciated horse, bodies being removed from dwellings by medical officials, people literally dying on the streets of Kharkiv. According to one 1997 estimate, collectivization in total, counting the victims of famine in Ukraine and Central Asia and the North Caucasus and the Volga, counting the dekulakized, counting all those who died premature or early deaths as a result of collectivization. Collectivization accounted for the deaths of 13 million men, women, and children. To put that number in perspective, 13 million people equal to the 1935 populations of Norway, Denmark, Finland, Portugal, and Bulgaria put together. The images we've just seen were suppressed. They were not published in Soviet books. They were not published in Soviet newspapers. They were not included in the Soviet newsreels that preceded musical comedies playing in Soviet movie halls and movie theaters. There was a different public face of collectivization. This is the happy, smiling, rosy-cheeked public face of collectivization, right? Young women workers marching off to the fields to do their part. And you see, again, this idea of the new Soviet woman as an equal and eager participant in the construction of socialism. Here, a man and a woman calling out to their buddies, "Come, comrade, join us in the collective farm. Join us in the kolkhoz." Again, happy, productive, well-fed collective farmers working in the fields, men and women side by side, sharing the labor, little children out here enjoying a beautiful sunny day. This is a collectivist shared enterprise, right? And in one of the most famous paintings of the collectivization era, happy peasants awaiting the arrival of the new tractor. And you see the tractor in the background, kind of chugging slowly into the distance, a couple of kulaks muttering amongst themselves as to what this will mean. But again, this idea that Soviet science, Soviet technology will remake the village. that Soviet gender policy will remake centuries of patriarchy and oppression in the village, that there will be new and fulfilling roles for women to play in the new agricultural economy. So the point I want to make here is that under collectivization, or thanks to collectivization, the physical contours of the village remained, but the tradition of the village changed. The way of life in the village, punctuated by the ringing of church bells, the celebration of Orthodox festivals, um, practices that had existed for centuries in Russian rural space, all of this comes crashing down as a consequence of collectivization. This poster declares, "Down with the antiquated village of our grandfather's day." And again, you see a Soviet tractor mowing down the priest and kulak, demolishing the church. So village life, the rhythms of rural life, change forever after 1929. Churches are shut down. New Soviet holidays replace old traditional festivals of harvest and sowing in the village. The old peasant elites who had held cultural power, wielded economic power, they're gone after 1930, right? They've been dekulakized. There's a new elite in the countryside, collective farm chairmen, party leaders. So 12 years after the October Revolution, not until 1929, does Bolshevism, the spirit of the revolution, and all that the revolution stands for, not until 1929 and the tidal wave of collectivization does the revolution really come crashing down into the Soviet village. The revolution moves beyond city space and it comes to the countryside in full and devastating force. So that's why we often refer to collectivization as the second revolution, or collectivization paired with the industrialization drive, these two aspects of the 5-year plan. We think of this maybe as the Stalin revolution, because Stalin has managed to do what the Tsarist regime had never been able to do. Stalin is able to establish firm state control over the Russian countryside. Between 1928 and 1932, the years of the first 5-year plan, the Soviet state's grain collection rose from 10.8 million tons of grain to 22.8 million tons of grain, more than doubling over the course of the first 5-year plan. So collectivization has seemingly solved the agricultural crisis that haunted the years of NEP, the new economic policy. Collectivization has given Stalin a steady supply of grain that can be used to feed the cities, feed the industrial workforce, and that can be sold abroad for hard currency needed to fund the industrialization project, to build up a strong military, to build up a strong technological base. As this poster proclaims, we were a country of the plow. We have become a country of the tractor and the combine. This again is a quote from Stalin in this 1934 poster. And you see the change, right? The hungry peasant with his horse showing its ribs, right? This has been replaced by sleek, modern, technological marvels of modernity, the tractor, the combine. So collectivization left many legacies. And it came at an inordinately heavy price. Millions are dead, livestock is decimated, more grain is reaching the cities, true, but real agricultural output in Russian space, Russian territory, real agricultural output will not reach pre-World War I levels until the mid-1950s. And it remains sluggish to this day. There's a lasting, simmering resentment in the countryside to this day toward the burden, the suffering that rural men, women, and children had to bear during the worst, most destructive years of collectivization. None of this light and dark, none of this nuance entered into official Soviet historical treatments of collectivization. Collectivization was always portrayed as an unqualified success. Peasant men and women marching off into the fields with their tractor, right? The gift of Soviet power. Labor is always seen as something joyous. Work is always seen as something to be welcomed and celebrated, something fulfilling, something in which men and women play equal roles. And note that a woman is driving a tractor in this poster. Progress. Here, a 1934 poster showing a happy family of collective farmers. Man, woman, child, they are prospering. They're doing well on the collective farm. You see in the top left, there's a certificate, a gramota, attesting to their status as good, productive kolkhoz workers. And you see, in what little we can see of their apartment, of their home, what little we can see of their home shows us that they have benefited materially from their hard work, from their work ethic. There's a bookshelf, right? Writings by Lenin and Stalin. There's a few works by Gorky. There's a work on agronomy, agricultural science. We see an electric bulb, so no smoky candles or lanterns. There's no icons. There's no residue of the past, pirizhitki, right? The gramota and the books, the certificate, the books, and the record player, best of all, testify to the new way of life that the collective farmers live, right? And along the bottom of the poster, there's a quote from Stalin attesting to the improvements that collectivization has made in the lives of the rural population. Stalin says, now every kolkhoznik has the opportunity to live in a civilized manner, so long as he wants to work in honest fashion and not live like a vagrant or sponge off of the collective farm. Probably should have ended that quote a little bit early because, or Stalin should have rather. It sounds better to say, now every kolkhoznik has the opportunity to live in a civilized manner. Literally, to live like a human being. And it's a really interesting sentiment, I think. The idea is that Soviet power, through the 5-year plan, has lifted the peasant up out of darkness and ignorance and superstition and made the peasant productive, happy, and prosperous. Soviet power has remade the old byt. Soviet power has remade the old way of life. And that's why we say that 1929 really is sort of a second revolution, because collectivization brings Soviet power and all that it represents into the village, for good and for ill. And the Russian countryside is never the same thereafter. So in 1929, Stalin says we're going to smash the kulaks, we're going to collectivize agriculture, and the response within the party is enthusiasm, great stormy applause. Stalin is tapping into this discontent that has built up within the ranks of the party over the course of the 1920s, as ordinary party members, men and women, are getting sick of NEP. They want to get back into the fast lane of socialist construction. They want to make the kulaks suffer. They want to see the NEP men who have profited during the 1920s suffer. So when we think about the Stalin years, and we think about all that Stalinism means, a theme we'll pick up again next week, one inescapable aspect of Stalinism is enormous popular enthusiasm. The party is fired up for Stalin's initiative, the 5-year plan at the end of the 1920s. The party is on board because party members see the 5-year plan, collectivization, rapid fire industrialization, as a revival of the heroic spirit of the Civil War, a revival of the heroic spirit of the revolution, an end to the blah of NEP, an end to the stagnation of NEP. As one party member, an ally of Stalin, put it triumphantly in 1929, the heroic period of our socialist construction has now arrived. And we don't think of heroism when we think of collectivization, but Stalin's initiative was seen as just that. It was seen as a return to the swaggering, romantic, swashbuckling spirit of the Civil War. And if we're going to build socialism, we will be the generation that builds socialism with our own hands. We will reap the benefits thereof. So when we think about Stalinism, we have to think always that there were true believers. It would be easy to write off the Stalin years as just a bad mistake, where things got a little bit out of hand. Things went a little bit too fast. Things got a little too crazy. The reality is that if you were a true believer in the cause, if you were a true believer in the cause of Soviet socialism, you could explain away any of the worst horrors of collectivization. You could rationalize them away. And this week I want you to read excerpts from the writings of Lev Kopelev. Kopelev was born into a middle-class Jewish family in Ukraine, the capital of Kiev. He joins the party, he joins the Bolshevik Party as a young man, and he takes part in the collectivization drive. He puts his studies on hold at university, and he goes off to sign up peasants for the collective farms. He goes door to door in search of kulak grain. He goes door to door smashing up cedar chests and breaking into closets to find out where the peasants have stolen their grain. He goes door to door confiscating the goods of kulaks. And he does so, he says, with an open heart and a clean conscience. Only later in life did Lev Kopelev come to doubt what he had done as a young man in the 1930s. Only later, as a much older man, did he come to realize that there was blood on his hands, even if only indirectly, for the kulaks who had been sent off to Siberia, for the children who had been made to suffer, for the old women and men who had died of neglect and disease, all in service of Kopelev's vision, his dream of building socialism. And as you read the text of Kopelev's book, The Education of a True Believer, he describes the things he did and the things he witnessed during the collectivization drive. And he says, I saw all of this. In the terrible spring of 1933, I saw people dying from hunger. I saw women and children with distended bellies turning blue, with vacant, lifeless eyes, and corpses. Corpses in ragged sheepskin coats, cheap felt boots, corpses in peasant huts, corpses in the melting snow. I saw all of this, and I did not go out of my mind or commit suicide, nor did I curse those in the party who had sent me out to take away the peasants' grain in the dead of winter. Nor did I lose my faith. As before, I believed because I wanted to believe. So I'm hoping that in our discussion this week, we can kind of peel back some of what this means. What does it mean to believe in the Stalinist project? Because I think this desire to believe is crucial to understanding the Stalin years. We cannot grasp or make sense of the Stalinist system if we imagine it to be some kind of tyranny hatched by a madman in the Kremlin and then imposed on millions of unwilling men, women, and children. No. Stalinism could only have worked. Stalinism could only have functioned because tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of true believers like Lev Kopelev wanted to believe that the ends that they were pursuing justified the means, the tactics they deployed. I want to stop there. We'll think more about this theme and others next in our next discussion. So again, as always, let me know if you have questions, and we will stop the video, and we will pick up our discussion on Friday. Thanks.